Coming up on The World Today, the World Health Organization on another description of the COVID-19 pandemic. This time, it's one big wave. Italian opera singer Andrea Bocelli is affected by new lockdown measures imposed on Italy due to the coronavirus pandemic. New Zealand says it has suspended its extradition treaty with Hong Kong following the new security law imposed on the region. A warm welcome to the program. I'm Akaite Afia. Thanks for joining us for this half hour. We began with the World Health Organization apparently watching how countries have been overwhelmed by the new coronavirus, but warning against complacency on the transmission in the Northern Hemisphere in the summer. The agency's spokesperson, Margaret Harris, says this coronavirus does not behave like influenza that tends to follow seasonal trends. And thinking in terms of waves, this is going to be a big one.
Thinking about seasons, what we all need to get our heads around is this is a new virus and it's behaving, even though it's a respiratory virus, and even though respiratory viruses in the past did tend to do this, different seasonal waves, this one is behaving differently. This one is one we have to be aware is learning about us as we're learning about it. There seems to be this persistent belief that summer's not a problem. Summer is a problem. This virus likes all weathers, but what it particularly likes is jumping from one person to another when we come in close contact. So let's not give it that opportunity.
And here is a pretty candid shot of the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson promoting a new cycling initiative to promote healthier lifestyles and ease pressure on transport networks amid the coronavirus pandemic. He says Britain will not hesitate to impose new quarantines to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The Prime Minister has reimposed a 14-day quarantine on new arrivals from Spain after a marked uptick of COVID-19 infections in the country's northeast. He says British ministers will take swift action to impose similar measures on other countries wherever necessary in order to prevent a second spike of the disease in the UK.
These are decisions for families, for individuals about where they want to go, and what we have to do is take swift and decisive action where we think that the risks are starting to bubble up again. And let's be absolutely clear about what's happening in Europe, amongst some of our European friends. I'm afraid you are starting to see in some places the signs of a second wave of the pandemic. And we all remember what happened last time. It's absolutely vital, therefore, that we make the necessary preparation.
All right, looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties there with Juliana, but we'll come back to that. So as we mentioned earlier, more countries in Europe are reconsidering measures at protecting tourists from Spain, with not just the UK, but now France and Germany warning against travel to parts of Spain. Meanwhile, authorities in Madrid have made wearing a face mask in public compulsory at all times, as a part of measures to prevent the spread of coronavirus in the city. Now, this comes as Spain reports a spike in cases in some regions during recent days. Here's the global update.
Germany's foreign ministry is advising holidaymakers not to travel to several Spanish regions, including Catalonia, home to Barcelona, that have seen coronavirus infection rates rise. The Interior Ministry says it's in favor of implementing mandatory tests, but couldn't imagine Germany reintroducing border controls in Germany. Spain's rise in COVID-19 cases has prompted most regions to impose rules for masks to be worn everywhere, and in several areas, including Barcelona, calls for people to stay at home. Meanwhile, Austria's health minister is warning against complacency after 62 people were infected with coronavirus at a resort town. Rudolf Anschober told reporters in Vienna that risk awareness had dropped, but that the pandemic was far from over. Austria's health agency says the outbreak was traceable to a bar in the town of St. Wolfgang near the German border, and that mainly interns were affected. Vietnamese authorities set up checkpoints and closed down shops to enforce a partial lockdown in Da Nang after a fresh outbreak was detected in the city. The city, a tourism hotspot, had reintroduced social distancing measures over the weekend after the government confirmed at least 14 new cases, the first reported domestically transmitted cases in more than 3 months.
The harsh reality, my friends, is that we are at war.
Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta has extended a nightly curfew for another 30 days to curb the spread of COVID-19.
Let us not think that we are immune or special. We're not. Please, fellow Kenyans, let us not follow the examples that we have seen across the world.
The curfew had been due to be lifted on August 6th or 7th. And in Egypt, hundreds defied government warnings over the coronavirus to crowd a vast seasonal livestock market near the capital without wearing face masks ahead of the Muslim Eid al-Adha holiday. The Al-Manashi livestock market in Giza is usually crowded with sellers and buyers before Eid, and the pandemic did not reduce their numbers. But few had much money to spend. Sellers said they had lowered their prices, but even then, buyers were scarce.
Keeping with the coronavirus, concerns over the spread of the coronavirus, Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison has cut short a planned Queensland tour to focus on the country's coronavirus crisis, citing a very complex outbreak on aged care homes in the city of Melbourne. Victoria, Australia's second most populous state today, reported 384 new cases of COVID-19, down from the record 532 it reported on Monday, with 6 additional deaths. This is still considered alarming to health officials.
Now, the situation in Victoria aged care is very complex. You have a combination of the community transmission, which is widespread in Melbourne, finding its way into many facilities. And in particular, it has found its way into the aged care workforce. The standing down, necessarily, of many in that workforce has had a very significant disruption to the provision of care in those facilities. The Commonwealth has been working, including with other states, to ensure that we can plug those gaps wherever we possibly can. But I want to be upfront with you. It's very difficult and it's very hard to get people into those positions, particularly given the complexity and difficulty of the situations they're facing.
Well, one person who thinks his country is probably overdoing it with measures aimed at curbing the coronavirus is opera singer Andrea Bocelli. The Italian says he feels humiliated and offended by lockdown measures as it felt like being imprisoned. He said he could not leave the house even though he had committed no crime. He also admitted to disobeying lockdown rules and believing the severity of the pandemic had been overblown. But Bocelli made the remarks at a conference in the Italian Senate attended by opposition politicians, including Matteo Salvini, leader of the far-right League Party. Well, let's talk to our correspondent in the UK, Juliana Olayinka, a little bit more about the UK imposing some of these travel restrictions on Spain. Juliana, welcome to the program.
Good afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me clearly.
Yes, we sure can. So to get right into it, it's not the UK imposing the restriction on travel from Spain alone. France and Germany are also on board with this, though they're taking their cue from the UK. It almost seems like Spain is being blacklisted here. I mean, is that a fair assessment considering all of these countries have been doing the best they can to curb the spread of the coronavirus?
Well, it depends who you speak to. Of course, Spain definitely feel that they have been blacklisted. They're really not happy. Their Prime Minister has been in talks with the UK government over the past couple of days, asking them and urging them to make a U-turn on this decision. On Friday night, the British government got some information showing that in certain regions in Spain, regions that are really popular with British tourists, were seeing spikes in COVID cases. These were only two regions, I believe. One of them is Catalonia, which of course contains Barcelona. This new restriction affects 600,000 British tourists who are in Spain. So I believe from Sunday night, anybody coming back in would be quarantined for 2 weeks. We know that Germany are also, as you said, doing similar measures. However, what's different between Germany and Britain's measure is that Germany are focusing on particular regions, and that's the discussion that's happening here in the UK at the moment. They only want there to be local lockdowns like we've seen in our own country in Leicester, in particular parts of Spain. We know that Spain, they desperately rely on British tourists. It was shut down for a couple of months. There were hopes that this new lifting of measures would revive the tourist industry, and alas, this has happened. And of course, you know, there are several people that are not happy. But even though the British government, the MPs are on recess at the moment, they're all enjoying their summer holidays, including the Transport Minister, Grant Shapps, who's in Spain. The House of Lords have been sitting today, and what we're expecting perhaps in the next couple of days is that they will say that this restriction isn't to the entirety of the Spanish country, but will be for particular regions.
All right. And as you mentioned, Spain does rely heavily on that tourism from the UK. And yesterday we learned some members of the Spanish Hotels Association have promised to offer free COVID-19 tests for tourists coming into Spain based off of the quarantine imposed by the UK. So how do British tourists feel about either quarantining in Spain before they begin their holiday or about the restrictions that come with trying to curb the pandemic?
And well, of course, you can imagine the British tourists are not happy. I don't know about you, but, looking on my social media, it appears as if many people are in Spain or in the south of France at the moment. They thought that they would be enjoying, their freedom. They've been locked down. Some people have been locked down for 4 months, and they were hoping, because of the advice that they were getting from the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister, that it was safe to do so. And alas, it isn't. If you can afford it, many people are okay with it. There are many companies up and down the breadth of Britain that are saying you can work from home, but unfortunately some people can't. So the fact that you've taken a week or 2 weeks holiday and then you go back and you have to work from home is not on. There are lots of discussions at the moment about whether or not people are going to be paid by the government. Will they get some money from universal credit? Will their employers accept the fact that they've got to work from home? Who knows? I told you that the House of Lords was sitting today discussing this urgent question about what they do going forward. And there were some lords that said, look, these British tourists have got what they asked for. If you decide to travel at the peak of a pandemic, when there already have been discussions of a second wave, then it's your responsibility to cope with whatever the fallout is. But, listening to the media and seeing reports on the front pages of the tabloids, Brits are not happy and they want answers from the British Prime Minister and the Transport Secretary immediately.
Well, hopefully they do get their answers very soon. Juliana, thank you so much for joining us today, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Coming up later on the program. Need a little cheering up during the pandemic? Well, let the world's largest virtual piano recital do that for you. Stay with us. welcome back. You're watching The World Today. So let's switch gears now over to Malaysia, where former leader Najib Razak has been found guilty of corruption and sentenced to 12 years in jail in the first trial over a multi-billion-dollar scandal at the state fund 1MDB that stretched to the Gulf states and Hollywood. In a case widely seen as a test of the nation's resolve to stamp out corruption and which could have big political implications, High Court Judge Mohammed Nazlan Mohammed Ghazali sentenced Najib to 12 years and a fine of 210 million ringgit or $49 million on a charge of abuse of power. The nearly $10 million in the SRC case is only a fraction of the funds Najib is alleged to have misappropriated from Malaysia Development Berhad, the state fund. Prosecutors say more than $1 billion of 1MDB funds made its way into Najib's personal accounts, over which he faces a total of 42 criminal charges. Najib has led the country for almost a decade before losing the election in 2018. New Zealand has suspended its extradition treaty with Hong Kong, amongst other changes, in a response to China's unpopular decision to pass a national security law for the territory. Earlier this month, Beijing imposed a new legislation on the former British colony despite the protests of Western nations and Hong Kong residents. Additionally, Australia, Canada, and the UK have all suspended extradition treaties with Hong Kong this month. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has ended preferential economic treatment for Hong Kong. Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters says New Zealand will treat military and dual-use goods and technology exports to Hong Kong in the same way as it treats such exports to China as a part of a review of its overall relationship with Hong Kong.
Longer. Well, 1997 there was a one country, two systems commitment by China. It's clear now that the law is no longer what it was, and therefore the extradition arrangements we have don't stand up. But if they should go back to honouring the commitment of 1997, then we'd revisit our situation as well. We have always taken our view as an independent country that it should be the choice of the New Zealand government, not some other government. No matter where the influence is coming from, we've got to make sure our stance is independent.
China says it strongly opposes New Zealand's suspension of the extradition treaty with Hong Kong. China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin says remarks from the New Zealand side and its measures are totally based on a misinterpretation of the for Hong Kong. He also says New Zealand has violated international law and the basic norms of international relations and is a gross interference in China's internal affairs. He says China remains determined to safeguard national sovereignty, security, and development interests and opposes external influences in Hong Kong affairs. Nearly 3 billion koalas, kangaroos, and other native Australian animals were killed or displaced by bushfires in 2019 and 2020, according to a study commissioned by the Worldwide Fund for Nature. It says some 143 million animals, 2.46 billion reptiles, 180 million birds, and 51 million frogs were impacted by the country's worst bushfires in decades. In calculations made when the fires were still blazing, ecologists put the number of affected animals at about 1 billion. The figures included animals displaced due to destroyed habitats, which then faced a lack of food and shelter or having to move to an already occupied habitat. The total number of animal casualties has been raised was due to researchers having now assessed the total affected area, rather than just looking at the most affected states. A British-Australian woman serving a 10-year sentence in Iran for espionage has been transferred to a notorious prison in the desert. Kylie Moore Gilbert, a lecturer at Melbourne University, has been in jail since September 2018. She was tried in secret and strongly denies all the charges against her. The Australian government has said it holds Iran responsible for Ms. Moore Gilbert's safety and well-being and is urgently seeking access to her. 8 people were killed on Monday in Karachi after a spell of monsoon rain flooded Pakistan's biggest city and commercial capital. Many areas in the city were flooded after the downpour, which started on Sunday, July 26th, and only subsided this morning. Floodwater accumulated in low-lying residences and on the roads in commercial districts, hampering traffic and forcing residents to wade through knee-high or waist-high water. Rescue officials from ED Foundation, a nonprofit organization that runs a network of ambulances, said most of the deaths occurred due to electrocution. When the coronavirus forced the world into lockdown earlier this year, millions felt isolated and longed to connect with other people. The piano instruction app Playground Sessions found a way, inviting musicians around the globe to learn the Josh Groban song, You Raise Me Up, for free and send in videos of their performance. It turned into the world's largest virtual piano recital. The company received around 1,000 videos from beginner, intermediate, and advanced participants from 52 countries.
You know, we had over 7,000 people learn. It was a free online class. Come and join us. And 52 countries participated. Over 900, close to 1,000 video submissions of people that at the end of the learning experience recorded their performance, and then we just went through this big editing process to put it all together. So if you watch the video, there's at points where there's 300 or 400 pianists, aspiring pianists playing together.
It gave everybody something to focus on during the pandemic that was totally removed from the pandemic. Such a positive thing. And the song, obviously, You Raise Me Up, it's just, a really uplifting, inspirational song. So.
Well, it's always beautiful to see something like that bring people around the world together. Thank you so much for joining us on The World Today. I'm Akaite Afia. Stay safe.